Welcome back to the special lecture series on the Korean wave, who are K-pop fans in Europe, fandom, fan activism, and subculture. And this program is organized by the Korea Europe Center at the Free University of Berlin. It is supported by the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. My name is Jo Young at the Institute of Korean Studies at FU Berlin, and I'm hosting this talk series. And today's presenter is Dr. Michael Fuhr from the University of Hildesheim here in Germany. And he will present K-pop fandom in Germany, themes and transformations.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me this afternoon. And yeah, for this special lecture on the Korean wave, it's a great opportunity for me to discuss some of my research findings and to actually to get back to my research on K-pop fandom in Germany, which reaches back, I think, 8 years from now. And so it's good to yeah, even for me to update myself and to engage in the discussion. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, which will I now start to share with you. So my today's presentation mainly draws from the from a collaborative research project on the audience reception and fan culture of K-pop in Europe, which I undertook with 2 colleagues. Dr. Oh-Mae Kyung from Liverpool Institute of Popular Music and Dr. Song Sang-yeon from Austria. So the 3 of us, we had looked into 3 different localities in Europe and to see, to compare different tendencies, but also to identify what are the local specificities of the K-pop fandom. I've been mainly using ethnographic methods such as participant observation and in-depth interviews during several fieldwork phases, the first of which took place from April to October 2013, and which I could revalidate through regular observations in the following years from then. So today I discuss some of the positions, practices, individual and social motivations and functions of K-pop fans in Germany, by giving prime attention to the participatory dimension of the K-pop dance, and thus on dance-related activities of several players, such as amateur dance group members or dance instructors. So let me start with a rough introduction. If you look into the Google Trends and the click rates over the past years on the K-pop search term, you quickly realize that there's a growing and steadily rising interest on the search term, with specific peaks, which maybe can be identified with some more media coverage on the phenomenon. For example, in 2012, Psy's Gangnam Style hit song, but also the popularity of BTS around 2018. And one of the specificities of the German context relates to the fact that the majority of official music video clips, including K-pop music videos, had been banned on the video platform YouTube, as Gangnam Style, for example. This was at that time due to unresolved conflicts over royalty payments between YouTube and the German Copyright Association, GEMA. The formal contract between the 2 parties expired in 2009. And a new one had not been renegotiated before November 2016. So for 7 years, while both parties could not agree on legal terms, YouTube decided to block the content of rights holders represented by the GEMA, and sometimes even that of non-GEMA members. This limited accessibility, however, seemed to have only little impact on the reception of K-pop. German fans and consumers quickly found ways to circumvent this technical boundary to access the videos, either by using unblocking software tools or by visiting alternative video platforms. Gangnam Style, for example, became a huge hit in Germany too, maybe not so much on video platforms, but still because of high mainstream media coverage, heavy rotation on radio shows, and frequent performances in public events and in nightclubs and bars. Thus, it can be said that YouTube's banning of video clips had not become a severe obstacle to K-pop fandom, although it seems equally to be true that it hindered K-pop indirectly penetrating German mainstream culture at large and expanding on a bigger scale. For this reason, K-pop in Germany must still regarded as a niche culture. This is characteristic of K-pop fan cultures in other parts of the world as well, and thus stands in stark contrast to the often exaggerated views pertinent in South Korean, very nationalistic reports, as well as in governmentally supported scholarly accounts, where we find this kind of martialistic rhetoric, like wordings like K-pop invasion or conquering the world through K-pop and so on. So here, this might be a reason why it's not become mainstream so quickly, but then we find roughly from the mid 2000s examples of K-pop in the mainstream music business. So since 2015, K-pop's visibility in the TV, mainstream TV, has been growing, for example, through Jamie Lee Krivitz, the German singer who won the TV talent show Voice of Germany and became the German representative of the 2016 Eurovision Song Contest in Stockholm with a stage rendition of manga and K-pop visuals. And of course, another example is the international media coverage of BTS, for example, on the cover of the Time magazine in 2018, but again 2020, so last year, but also on the Bravo, which is the German youth magazine, which yeah, I think quite directly shows that it's became a bit more than just a niche cultural phenomena. And the general increase of awareness is also suggested by a representative Google survey among 500 Android users of the so-called Google Opinion Rewards app in Germany, which we conducted in spring 2019. And one of the questions we asked was, have you ever listened to K-pop or to Korean popular music? And then we found that nearly a quarter of the respondents has listened to K-pop music. And when another question was, for example, questions on accessibility to K-pop music through YouTube and what exactly they were preferring in view of, for example, BTS. And it is quite clear that the dance choreography is one of the prime reasons for listeners to engage with BTS consumption. Then a quick look at the geographical dispersion of Google users reveals that the majority of people interested in K-pop is located in major cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Essen, and Frankfurt, but also in the areas of high population density, respectively, such as Berlin or North Rhine-Westphalia, the Ruhr area, and the Rhine-Main area around Frankfurt, which are areas with high Korean and Asian immigrant population density, along with strong social and economic networks as well. So yeah, generally speaking, K-pop is still a do-it-yourself culture with many individual fans and small fan communities in very different places of the country, who usually heavily engage in online activities, which is, for example, Facebook or Twitter and Tumblr, but recently also TikTok, and more seldomly in organizing offline meetings. Fan groups are mostly loosely organized, widely dispersed and decentralized, relatively isolated, and often engaged in very mixed Korea-related activities that go beyond mere K-pop music consumption. So they also include cooking Korean food, for example, or watching K-drama and so on. Fan communities are reflecting the geographical size and the federal structure of Germany. So especially in the beginning, there were not anything such as the nationwide fan clubs, but we had fan groups named after the federal state they are located in. For example, K-pop group in North Rhine-Westphalia, K-pop in Lower Saxony, K-pop in Bavaria. So these kinds of K-pop fan groups in Facebook, for example, they were quite vibrant at that time. K-pop fandom is based on what media scholar Henry Jenkins once termed as grassroots intermediaries, who are slowly emerging, whereas mainstream media coverage of K-pop remains nearly inexistent for a long time. The definition of grassroots intermediaries would be they are digitally empowered consumers who play a central role in shaping the reception of those media products, emphasizing rather than erasing the mark of their national origin and educating others about the cultural tradition they embody. So this quite links up to the discussion of what Professor Lee recalled as the question of the K in K-pop or in the Korean wave. Maybe we can discuss this later on. So these cultural intermediaries or intermediate digitally empowered consumers, they have a key role in not erasing but improving or supporting the national origin, which then is identified as Korean in this terms of K-pop. Okay, let's move over to the K-pop fans. Who are the fans? And a word on the demographics here as well, as we had yesterday on the Swedish perspective. I found many similarities to the German context. Here again, it's quite difficult to evaluate this the number of fans because there's no official data. There are only estimations based on my own observations, but also from the people involved in the scenes, which range between 5 and 15,000 K-pop fans. Whereas of course it's difficult to define what is a fan, and who are really active fans. But when you look into the biggest, for example, face group pages for example, this K-pop meetings in Germany, which has more than 12,000 subscribers, then you get an idea about the quantity so far. Then there's a certain age segment we are confronted with, which are mostly teens and 20-somethings, ranging between 18 and 25, roughly, with 80 to 90% female fans. Most of them are still high school students or university freshmen and students, workers, trainees, job seekers, mostly in the service or cultural or welfare sectors. When it comes to those people that I interviewed or that I had conversations with. Then very similar to the Swedish case, I think, is that we can roughly say that half of the fan culture consists of white majority Germans, middle class Germans, and 50% of people with a migratory background, a strong Asian migratory background as well. And what is also very striking is that there are not many fans of Korean migratory background, but if Asian, then mostly of Chinese-speaking countries and also from the Vietnamese communities. This is a quick look again on the age groups of the coming from a general survey conducted by K-pop fans in 2012, which has more than 50% of the K-pop fans identified between 14 and 17 years. Many German fans appreciate K-pop as a well-designed entertainment package, which consists of all-round entertaining idol stars and a bundle of attractive components: look, music, video, fashion, dance, etc. The dance aspects in K-pop, the group cover dance in particular, bear a highly participatory function and are thus pivotal in many individual and collective fan activities. The K-pop group dances rely on choreographies that can be easily learned by non-professional dancers and that include signature dance moves and constantly rotating front dancers, also called multi-top formation. Where do we find these K-pop dance-related events and activities? First of all, of course, in the K-pop flash mobs. There were a number of K-pop flash mobs organized by local fan groups in different German cities, much in the wake of the bigger K-pop flash mobs held in Paris and London in 2011, which European fans attended to call for additional shows of SM entertainment acts in the case of Paris, and to bring YG entertainment acts to London. Although the flash mobs were a short-lived trend that soon disappeared, they were important because K-pop fans got to know each other some of them started cover dance groups, which are still long lasting, as we still find nowadays. So this is one example of a cover dance group based in Neuss, called Remotion, a 7-member group, where only one of these members is still living in Neuss. Two of them are from cities very far from Neuss, and they told me that they take a 2-hour train to regularly twice a week to join the trainings and to meet up and so on, to discuss their dance moves and so on. So which shows that there's a high enthusiasm and high engagement of the people involved to really exercise and engage in their fan activities as dancers. They are training in the community center in Neuss, which is free of charge. And they also produce their own videos and engage in competitions and in conventions, so in public arenas, to showcase their fandom and dance activities. Another group is 149, or used to be 149, a group from Hamburg, which I interviewed, and I asked them why K-pop, and one answer was from Alex and DC, who told me K-pop is colorful, K-pop is flashy, K-pop is different. In K-pop, there are band members with choreographies, which, for example, are not that strong than in American pop. Now that is becoming a trend with Usher and Justin Bieber, for example, who have also choreographies. We don't find them bad, but in K-pop, the choreographies are interesting. And when you watch the shows and movies, you see that people are mostly likable, and we discover them to be normal. The language is actually not that important, but the combination that they dance and sing and that they have an incredible precision, which is why it is quite attractive to dancers. So another place or location to perform the fandom is our fairs and festivals, convention contests. At that time, it was a career convention, a youth convention in Berlin. But since then, the number of public events have increased and were heavily supported by cultural embassies in Germany, by the consulates, and also by the private sector as well, where we find the signifier, the K culture signifier. Here, these are some impressions from the Youth Culture Fair in 2013. Which had the logos K Food and K Sports and K-Pop. So the K culture is a policy term in the meantime, which we find intersecting with the K-pop fandom and also supporting local fandom, especially in Germany. And this is ongoing, and the Changwon K-pop World Festival with local auditions. Even in Germany, I think there are 3-4 locations where there are auditions to bring the K-pop dance groups to Korea. This is supported by KBS, by the Korean media, but also by the Korean embassies in Germany. So this kind of cultural diplomacy strategies and activities are still ongoing nowadays. Maybe they put on hold this year and last year due to the pandemic, but it still will continue after that. So there is, of course, another side would be the contest promoted or organized by private partners, like the dance schools, for example. One example is the Triton Dance School from Bremen, who was one of the first to launch such kind of events, take in sponsors, and bringing the first generation of German K-pop fan dancers together to perform in a competition, which was quite fun-oriented, but still very vibrant and heavily engaged by many youngsters who attended and performed there. At that time, you can see the list of the groups who performed and the songs who were performed. This was also 2013-14. So this actually mirrors the trend charge at that time, even in Korea. Yeah, and an impression of the Triton Dance School and the group performance. So these are the sites, and then of course there are a growing number of K-pop dance parties in different locations in Germany, which is also an important site for the fans to meet up and to exchange. So I would like to talk a little bit about bigger themes and transformations that I think are quite interesting and notable when we look at K-pop fandom in Germany. And I want to start with participation and pleasure, because it's very obvious, and it's the outstanding appeal derives from a kind of newly combined type of participation and pleasure it offers to its consumers. Next to diverse non-musical forms of fan participation, such as following their stars or gaining information about them, communicating with other fans, creating paratext, for example, through fan posts, comments, websites, blogs, or fan fiction, attending concerts and purchasing fan paraphernalia. It is the K-pop dances, as a result of strategic production planning, that invite fans to actively, collectively, and bodily participate in the musical process. And I found a good concept from Thomas Torino, who's an American ethnomusicologist, in his book, Music: A Social Life, the term of participatory music. I quote from his book: "Participatory music and dance have special qualities and characteristics for creating solid feelings of community and identity. Participatory music dance traditions exist the world over, and this suggests that they fulfill some basic human needs and desires." So this is a quite anthropological understanding from participatory music, from music, about music in general. This is because it's not, and it quite fits to this K-pop fandom, because it's not possible to grasp K-pop fandom in terms of a single clear-cut and stable identity formation. K-pop does not represent a subcultural phenomenon with a coherent semiotic system, which necessarily counteracts a hegemonic cultural system, and with a shared repertoire of aesthetical values and preferences, as we know from earlier studies on the local appropriation of global styles, such as, for example, punk music or hip hop. We may rather see K-pop fan communities as what Torino called cultural cohorts, a term by which he means, and I quote again, social groupings that form along the lines of specific constellations of shared habit based in similarity of parts of the self. End of quote. It is these parts of the self that affirmatively respond to the specific danceability of K-pop songs, thus eliciting forms of pleasure, collectivity, and the potential of individual change. And we see this potential for individual change in interview snippets such as this from Nancy, who told me the K-pop stars get the fun across pretty well. I think they really get drilled, they take lessons in acting and so on. They are treated harshly, but what they get across is simply pleasure, colors, fun. It's a wide spectrum. It's a big picture that is important. If you would strip it down, there would hardly be anything left. And then she continued, since we started with K-pop, we have found a lot of friends who are thinking in the same way as we do and who share our attitude. Well, I have to say that I feel like having a family here. These guys are not only my friends, I'd go through hell and high water for them. I am there for them. That is my feeling. You also want to be there for your family. You want to get something and you want to give something. This is hard to find in other genres, I guess. For me, I can say, K-pop changed my life. Now I have found people who share my attitude towards life. We have become best friends. We are like a family. So this is quite a typical quote from the fans in these groups, and relates to what Larry Rossberg once defined as a very positive aspect of fandom, which is the side of the optimism, invigoration, and passion, which are necessary conditions for any struggle to change the conditions of one's life. But at the same time, we also see the forms of distinction and transgression. And first of all, there's an aesthetic distinction to Western pop, finding in quotes like, again, Nancy, whom I asked, is there a difference between K-pop and Western pop? And answers were, besides the language. And Dennis added, the Koreans have a lot more fun in what they are doing. I think, well, when you compare Britney Spears' song, Baby Hit Me One More Time, and K-pop, I would say the Korean stars are smiling more. They have much more fun in the whole thing. Nancy, yes, but above all, it's so brightly colored. We don't have that here. And Kalisha, it is fascinating because it is something that does not exist here in German music. And then maybe relating a little bit to what we know from J-pop, or Japanese pop cultural fandom, the nerd or otaku phenomenon. So the distinction to the wider German mainstream society, but also the wider peer context. Nancy also told me the problem that we have here in Germany is that we are quickly disparaged and put down as freaks because we are so different, because we are dressed in brighter colors and it's weird. But even in our private lives, we are wearing brighter colors than before. That influenced us a lot. So yeah, so we can discuss about this also relating to what Tobias Hübinette yesterday mentioned. So this minority presence is quite visible here as well, and can also be then seen in the makeup of the groups and the cast. Yeah, because I think there's a significant role in K-pop as well, the transgression of social boundaries. While fandom always bears a potential for transgressing social categories, we can find in the cast of K-pop cover dance groups good examples of blurred boundaries of ethnicity, age, gender, and class-based education or occupation. More conspicuous, however, is the aspect of ethnicity. In many dance groups, we can find members of different ethnic backgrounds. And here again is the example of 149, the group from Hamburg, which consists of people with German, Turkish, Kurdish, Chinese, Vietnamese, or Vietnamese backgrounds, it's quite similar to many groups that we find at that time, but still today. So another specific precondition to the German K-pop fandom is the presence of a strong fan base of Japanese pop. Nearly all K-pop fans in the 20s and early 30s I talked to grew up reading Japanese manga and watching anime during their teenage years, of which some also later turned to listening to J-pop and Visual K, and to become active members of the local cosplay scene. Paramount to the Japan pop consumption were German TV channels which began broadcasting new Japanese animation series on a daily basis, mostly after school had finished since the 1995. So examples like Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Inuyasha thus belong to the shared cultural memory of this generation of J-pop fans, also called Visus, Visual K fans, who nowadays have shifted their interest to alternative yet Asian forms of popular culture. Many of them discovered K-pop videos through their J-pop fan forums and websites, and gradually discovered that there were Korean singers involved in anime productions by, for example, singing the opening and ending songs of the series, or by being camouflaged as J-pop singers, as we find in earlier K-pop stars like Boa or Dongbang Shinki in Japan. The visual cultural DJ team from Dortmund, consisting of two avid German J-rock fans, DJ K and DJ Tom, have been organizing J-rock club events and parties since 2005 in bigger cities in North Rhine-Westphalia. For example, the Kabuki rock style. Since 2013, they included K-pop to their repertoire because the number of guests asking for K-pop songs was increasing from party to party. That K-pop has entered the J-pop scene is, of course, not without conflict, especially with the die-hard fans. But what can be observed is that the demand of K-pop songs is growing, and that intermediaries, such, again, the visual culture DJ team, that meanwhile runs their own business as an event management company, is capitalizing on this trend. And this we find also with other outlets and retailers or publishing companies. For example, Raptor Publishing is a magazine, publishing magazines for the J-pop and Japanese pop culture community in Germany. With them, I think it's a monthly magazine, Koneko, and many others. And they also, since 2012, started releasing K-Bang, directly targeting the Korea-related fan bases. And this is still ongoing. Okay, another theme is the aspect of credibility and hierarchy and the cultural economy of fandom, which is still very small, but also growing, as it is also driven by these grassroots intermediaries, which I mentioned in the beginning, who started as fans, but then turned into active promoters and providers of K-pop. And here one example is Lisa Usagi. Maybe I'm not quite sure, Lisa, if you are also in the audience, maybe you can also join later in the discussion, who I frequently met yeah, had just recently an interview with her again on the scenes. And interesting is that at that time when we met, she was a 22-year-old high school graduate and a paralegal apprentice from Bremen. She started several fan initiatives and websites and became a K-pop dance instructor at the private Triton Dance School in Bremen. And she turned into an authority within the German K-pop community, as can be sensed from her many activities. Next to teaching K-pop in the dance school, she was a member of a K-pop cover dance group and administrator of 2 Facebook groups for K-pop fans in Germany. One was K-pop Fans in Bremen, which was launched in 2010 as one of the earliest German K-pop fan sites on Facebook, with having around 130 members at the time. And then, as I already mentioned, the K-pop meetings in Germany, which was launched in December 2010 and has recently got more than 12,000 subscriptions. The latter website enjoys such a high popularity among K-pop fans that even booking agencies of the boy group Beast, for example, at the time, asked her to help promote the group's concert in Berlin in 2012. In exchange, Lisa was provided the train fare and a free ticket of the group's concert. As a die-hard fan at the time, Lisa also traveled to other places such as Dresden and Paris to watch her favorite K-pop groups. She collected fan paraphernalia and she organized a number of K-pop fan meetings and flash mobs. And she was also interviewed by KBS World Radio on the situation of K-pop fandom in Germany. So Lisa's one example of this growing cultural economy of K-pop in Germany. In her case, the financial capital she gained from her activities is quite low, despite her earnings from the dance school courses, whereas the cultural capital within the fan community is relatively high. In contrast to her, other players have already started to capitalize on the growing fandom and have turned their interest in K-pop into profit-making endeavors, even though they may yet remain small scale. In this, so in the study, Triton, the dance school is an example, or the visual cultural team. Another one is just quickly is Helena Kwan, who was a dancer, professional dancer in the K-pop industry, born in Bremen, then moved over to Korea, trained in Germany, in the Netherlands, but also in Seoul, received idol training, became a background dancer, quit the industry then in Korea and came back to Germany to then launch her own entertainment company, which had quit recently, quite recently. But the idea of bridging culture was quite paramount for her business idea. And I guess we find many other people who have engaged and try to capitalize and monetize the fandom culture in Europe and in Germany. What she did was, next to giving K-pop dance classes, to direct her business company with the specific goals to build a bridge between Korean and German culture, to promote knowledge about Korea among Germans, and especially to prepare German teens for auditions on Korea. But also because this is not easy, as we know, when we look into the industry conflict. Maybe I show you quickly the next slide, which roughly shows the conflict of the K-pop industry, which is on the one hand more globalizing itself and trying to recruit more and more international dancers or aspirants to become the next K-pop idols. So we have this quite harsh export-oriented business. But on the other hand, we have quite a high demand of various skills, Korean language skills, but also beauty ideals, the preference for ethnic Korean and Asian faces, but also the behavioral codes, the filial piety, and quite rigid learning culture, which is quite maybe awkward or at least very strange to youngsters raised in German educational systems. So, and this is also a risk somehow for the industry, or kind of limitation to further internationalize their industry and their marketing strategies. So to bridge these boundaries, I think the idea is reasonable that Helena Kwan had, and she was had all the skills to try to establish this bridge. Quite quickly, which is quite obvious, is that the K-pop fandom relies very much on technology, on digital technology, on the social media, not in bringing people together and forming social communities, but also directly it penetrates the dance routines and activities from the rehearsing studio to the stages, because social media is very important for the provision of dance video versions and all the practice videos that we can find, where the fans can dance along the choreographies provided by the entertainment companies. And then the dance video clips could be mirrored, they could be slowed down and looped and so on. So different technical strategies to really perfectionize their own bodily routines. More interesting is the aspect of travel and collaboration, because we find individual networks which are formed transnationally between different or among the scene and crossing national borders, and even K-pop groups, like we have here two K-pop dance groups, K-Dance from Cologne and from another from Mönchengladbach, who teamed up for performing, for doing stage performances and conventions and so on. So there's a lot of, there's high collaborative mindset and also practical routines where they regularly meet up and perform and train and also publicize their activities on the internet. And I think this is interesting in a wider scope when we look into the other countries where we find kind of transnational also mobilities among certain segments of these fan groups. Yeah, here roughly you see some keywords again, and I want to close. Yeah, let me read out some conclusion remarks on the conclusion. K-pop fandom is highly driven by and organized around practices of consumption. It initially exemplified a sort of pop cosmopolitanism from below, principally following the strands of grassroots convergence, another term by Henry Jenkins, the media scholar, grassroots convergence. While engaging in fan cultural activities, German K-pop aficionados entangled themselves in complex processes of negotiation relating to questions of nationality, ethnicity, and gender. They examine the possibilities of what it means to them to be a German K-pop fan, to be a female who impersonates male idols, or to embody ethnic otherness in front of white local audiences. At best, K-pop elicits in them a sense of global consciousness. And cultural competency. This is obviously the case with Korean studies students whose initial fandom of Korean pop culture led them to improving their cultural sensibilities and to expanding their knowledge about Korea. K-pop thus unfolds the potential of realigning fan biographies through the evocation of Korean and East Asian imaginaries. This is best demonstrated by those K-pop fans who redirect their prior career plans towards pursuing a future perspective in the South Korean job market. And we will listen to the Korean studies situation later on, I think on Friday. I'm quite curious just to see the context on that. And how this has an effect on job careers and career plans, especially. Music and dance serves as constitutive elements of K-pop fandom by which its members embark on the playful construction and negotiation of their own identities. K-pop fandom thus provides a creative cultural space in which the youngsters are able to articulate alternative identities beyond their hegemonic imaginations about youth culture in German mainstream media and political discourses. K-pop fans engage in multiple aesthetic and social practices in a very experimental manner, and by doing so, they deal with questions of representation regarding to aesthetics, gender, ethnicity, and nationality. They cultivate their bodies by appropriating the dance moves and postures in the K-pop videos, by attiring in self-tailored costumes, by fashioning their hairstyles, and using cosmetics. They cope with the other gender respectively. As female fans impersonate male idols and male fans impersonate female idols, they adopt behavioral and gestural patterns from the K-pop idols and incorporate them in individual ways into their habitus and daily repertoires of expression. They learn to speak the Korean language and also create their own language in terms of fan cultural slang. They create social activities and networks, develop friendships and collaborations. While they stage their fandom in public spaces, for example in flash mobs and cover dances, it becomes quickly apparent that their visual presentation, that may include amateurish dance moves, mixed ethnic casts, non-shaped figures and non-trendy looks, it greatly differs from the standards dominant in the K-pop industry as well as in German mainstream pop. Instead, inclusiveness and non-professionality are the ruling features here. K-pop fandom thus serves as a significant site for the display of alternative youth subjectivities in Germany. There is a social function that seems to be particularly important, evermore in times of abounding TV talent casting shows, rigid beauty ideals and fashion regimes modeled after anorexic media celebrities, neoliberally infused self-optimization and aspirate perfectionism, and surging xenophobia nurtured by nationalistic, political, and everyday discourse. For a long time, the musical relationships between Korea and Germany have largely been dominated by the hegemony of European classical music. While classical music, with its musical idioms, styles, concepts, practices, repertoires, and instruments, had left its unprecedented mark on musical life in Korea throughout the 20th century, Korean people, students, musicians, and scholars entered music conservatories, concert houses, and recording studios in Europe and the US to pursue their careers in the fields of Western classical music. As a result of accelerated globalization processes, such as migration and the use of digital technologies, the musical and cultural exchange processes between Korea and Germany have increasingly diversified and partly reversed. Popular music made in South Korea and sold around the globe under the label K-pop signals these processes in a most vivid and colorful way. K-pop's arrival in Germany challenges the long-standing cultural asymmetries between Germany and Korea, and thus the hegemony of European classical music, and with it, the widespread perception of Koreans as classical musicians, and adds to a more variegated image of Korean music and culture in Germany. For the time being, it still remains an open question though whether the range of transformations that have been taking place with K-pop's inflow to Germany may contribute to a more significant and positive image of South Korea among Germans. These transformations are worthwhile to be considered in the future development of K-pop fan culture in Germany. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Fuhr. It was a very interesting and informative presentation about this spread of K-pop in Germany with a lot of enriched examples. So now I would like to give audience the chances to ask him questions. So you can send us your questions through the chat, or you can raise your hands. I think there is this hand raising function in the chat, right? Then ask questions by yourself. All right, while people are preparing for their questions, then let me first start. Your presentation, you mentioned something about this xenophobia, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and then I was wondering whether this then Korean pop culture, K-pop, can be seen as something alternative or substituting this Chinese dominance, or it could be something, opposite that, this emerging Chinese power also would have some positive synergy effect on the Korean culture. So, I mean, because in Germany, I mean, people don't necessarily strictly distinguish Chinese and Koreans. And I don't know if people in their mind really Korean culture is something distinctively different from Chinese ones or Japanese ones. So, I mean, how should we interpret the relationship between this emerging China and xenophobia in Germany, and this also growing interest in K-pop? What would be the relationship then?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a big question and a good one. I don't have any clear answer, but I think it's I think it's necessary to look into these more youth cultural phenomena, and even if it's quite small, I think we can learn a lot about it in terms of within the context of a broader political sphere, which we in Germany face right now, and not only in Germany but in Europe or maybe around the globe, with a more xenophobic or right-wing tendencies and so on. So the question of social coherence is quite paramount at this moment, and many people are thinking about how can this social coherence be enabled, maybe also not only by political means, but also by the means of cultural expression and cultural intermediation. And for me, as an ethnomusicologist or music scholar, I'm also very much interested in the function and the social function of music. And here, what I experienced, or what we observed in these very small communities is this, and what Tobias yesterday also mentioned from the Swedish case, is that we find a lot of heterogeneous groups within the fan community, which have kind of minority positions, probably. And by doing that, and it's not necessarily so much governmentally organized and formatted and support, of course, a little bit supported, but we find a lot of self-autonomous dynamics and self-organized activities within these groups, and a lot of positive ways of coming together, of bridging boundaries and so on. So this gives a hint, or gives an idea how pop culture can be maybe used within a more institutionalized settings as well, and in public spaces like museums, or in the sphere of curatorial practice, difficult word, and so on. So this would be interesting to see. So xenophobic tendencies are quite widespread, and when it comes to the xenophobic tendencies against East Asians in Germany, or especially in terms, in view of culture as the dominant or rising world power, I think it's still, I think it's still necessary to distinguish these trends or these perspectives, and to really also inform about the distinction of these different discourses. Because in the discourse in the realm of the fandom and Korean culture at large, or Hallyu at large, I think people are quite aware that both Korean and Chinese, and they don't mix it up. But the general public or the mainstream public, they wouldn't have any clear picture. And this is also very similar to the Swedish case, that if there's an image of East Asia, then of course China and Japan are dominant, and Korea is not very well known, or people are not very aware of what especially South Korea is about nowadays. And I think there's much more media coverage also on the North Korean situation, because it's more sensational to report on that. But on the other hand, in very specific segments of even the media discourse nowadays, especially when we look into how each of the countries struggle with the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, then Germany is also looking at what's the situation and how the politicians in South Korea are dealing with it as a positive, as a role model, for example. So in these very narrow segments, I think the mainstream audience gets an idea about South Korea, but it's not necessarily connected to popular cultural fandom. So this is something we really have to look into more details. And especially when it, for me, it's interesting to look into the musical field and to see how and where are coherence or interference between or among different East Asian musicians, for example. So Chinese music students and scholars located in Germany, how do they relate to maybe Korean students, music students, and so on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. Thank you very much. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There is one question from Helena Buja. Ms. Buja, should I read out your question, or would you like to ask the questions by yourself?
No, it's not exactly a question. I just wanted to congratulate Dr. Fuhr for this nice presentation. And while he was giving the presentation, I was searching for a paper that I also wrote on the spread of K-pop in Romania. And I realized that we participated in the same event some years ago. And I realized that he had another paper on K-pop in the same volume, and I was going to say that I intend to read it. Yeah, I'm not exactly, focused on K-pop music, but rather on Korean culture in general. But K-pop is also part of the Korean culture, so it goes together. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for joining the discussion, and good to meet you again.
Yeah, all right. So we might compare our findings and see to what extent the situation in Germany mirrors the one in Romania, or the other way around. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. I mean, the presentations and discussions are about exchange ideas, and I think we are perfectly now there. Yeah, okay. We have one further question. Mr. Kang, Sung-gang. Yeah, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really helpful to have an overview of the situation, and also already a kind of history of K-pop fandom in German context. I found it really interesting. Last year, there was a lot of media coverage of K-pop fandom culture, especially due to the BTS ARMY's participation in Donald Trump's election campaign. And there was some media reports about who are K-pop fans in the West, and among others, some people describe K-pop fans, they are also largely not only women, but also there are lots of queer people. So I was wondering if you could also observe that kind of tendency in German context.
Yes, thank you for this question. I haven't looked into that. I have not looked into that deeply, but I got a sense that there might be connection which perfectly fits into this idea of the minority presence. And I recently saw that there's a interlap or an overlap between these communities, and I'm quite curious to learn more about the queer community's engagement in K-pop and the vice versa. So this is something which I might look into in the future, on the near future, because this is, I think, has changed in recent years, where I was a bit disconnected from this part of study, and I revisit my earlier study now, and it's really quite interesting. Because of course, what you mentioned is also really, I'm wondering about this. Also, wondering about this question, which many people raise these days. Even the media, German media, is asking what is the political relevance of K-pop fans in Europe, and I think we can say that it's not as politicized as it's in the US, where we know that the so-called K-pop stans are quite active, and what you mentioned in the re-election campaigns of Donald Trump and so on. And I couldn't find any similar thing in the German context among the German fans, because maybe it's to do also with the age group, that they are quite young and maybe not so much maybe formed or engaged in political realms. I'm not quite sure. Maybe they are engaged in Friday for Futures and more ecological campaigns or movements, but it's not identified or easily identifiable at the moment so far. But this would be interesting in the future, while also these people are growing older. Maybe there's a more political awareness which is rising and then being somehow negotiated with their K-pop fandom. This would be quite interesting to see. But so far, I cannot see any connections, or to say at least the strong connections. But the LGBT community is quite interesting, as it's also has these minority positions. So there are these kind of intersectional analysis would be quite interesting to have in this part of the study. What I found in many cases is that there are, as we know, the 90% female persons in these groups, but then we also find male dancers, and there are some tendencies to play around their gender identities. It's not quite clear, and maybe they are not really identified themselves belonging to a queer community, but there are some kind of more even coquettish play around with these images and imaginations. So yeah, but this is a good point to have a deeper look into in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, this point I asked, we conducted a survey with students in Korean studies last month about their Hallyu experience. And there actually what we found was that, students, they participated in this Black Lives Matter or Me Too movement through these K-pop organized fan clubs. So, I could see some, growing tendency or evidence that K-pop could play as a channel of other types of social activities or engagement.
Yes.
And we have, I see a couple of more questions here. So first, Professor Lee, Yoon-jung, you can now go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fuhr, for your great presentation. I'm very happy to hear you now. And you remember we had so for 10 years ago and then for 5 years ago had a similar events. Actually, we organized the workshop on Hallyu in Europe, and then in 2015 or 16 about Korean wave in Germany. And now this time or the reaction on a Hallyu is a totally different one. So especially after Parasite and BTS and COVID, maybe we will see what kind of development will take this Korean wave in, especially in Germany. From now on, we have to see or we observe that. But in your presentation, I have 3 questions. Because it's really interesting that you mentioned about the mixed culture, actually the hybrid character of Korean K-pop is especially. And I remember our common friend, Dr. Song Ha-suk, explained me once that with the success of German classical music in the late 18th century, the essential of this success was this mixture of the popular music at the time. So in Germany, the classical music of Germany was a mixture from the English and the other things. And she asked me for 10 years ago, in her what do you say, defense for her doctoral thesis. No? So actually, that was the situation in Germany with classical music. So classical music at the time was the popular music, and now we have the Korean K-pop, and because it's just Korean, well, now we are we call it as popular music. Why we have to criticize this mixed culture, mixtures of mixed character or hybrid character of K-pop, or why we are discussing so often about that? That was my first comment. And then second question or comment is it's really interesting that to observe in your presentation, you mentioned that the social class or migration background of the fans for K-pop in Germany, and it's the really similar one. What Dr. Hübner told us yesterday. So, but I didn't realize that we had that there are some such a kind of discussion. The social background of the fandom would be very interesting. Is this a special phenomenon in Europe? Is the special thing that this fandom is identified in a lower working class or some special minorities in a society? Is that are you seeing in that phenomena in other regions like US or Southeast Asia? That would be interesting to know. If you compared with this region. And my last question would be, yes, you mentioned that the role of the students in the Korean studies. We are asking every year when we have new students whether they are fans of Korean K-pop or why they had decided to study Korean studies. And then our next question is usually, had played the K-pop an important role or not? The majority of the students are saying, or they answered, yes, they began, or their interest for Korea started with the K-pop, but at the time they were 12 or 14 years old. From that time, from then they started to study about, they tried to get more knowledge about Korea, and then they decided to study Korean studies. So maybe our students is a more they are when you mentioned in a K-pop fans as a cohort, cultural cohort. No? So there are age groups. So I remember when 2011, the most our students were fans either Super Junior or Big Bang. Now I don't know. There will be a difference. So it's, the image of the students for Korean studies is just too strong. They are too strong identified with the K-pop, but that looks not the fact. We will see at Friday discussion, but that was our survey when what we made in the last few years. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for your questions and remarks. I think the last point is quite interesting to me as well, because in the last couple of years I was very often invited to give a talk on these topics on K-pop and Korean wave. With these invitations coming from Korean studies departments in Germany, not so much from the music departments. So I was, of course, I met a growing number of students, and found that some of the students also I met before being dancers in the K-pop dance groups. So this was quite nice to trace them back to their K-pop dance activities, and to find them then at that time enrolled as Korean studies students. So I know that the number of Korean studies students has been growing in the past due to the success of Hallyu and K-pop. But I'm curious to see how many of them are really accomplishing the studies. So are really majoring in Korean studies, and what are they then doing? Is there really a chance for them to somehow capitalize on their fandom, Korean studies knowledge, and so on? So something which really has a more sustainable effects, which is quite interesting for the Korean government as well, and for different players in that segment. So and to your second question on the migration background, this is I think this is very similar. We found this in Austria as well, and in the UK, and I think in other parts in Europe as well, that there's a strong the cast of these groups are very mixed in terms of ethnicity and nationality, and that they have also kind of awareness about their migrant background and the kind of belongings, so kind of very complicated belongings to their parents' home countries, but also to Korea. So where Korea is kind of maybe a third space, or kind of a middle place, which quite nicely functions as a kind of also a place of intermediation. And with the class aspect, I'm a bit cautious, because these are youngsters. They are quite in their formative years. They haven't started their jobs, and they are still, many of them are in school, but also studying or starting studying. So it's quite difficult to refer them to a low working class segment or to a lower middle class segment. I'm not quite sure if this really works fine, this analysis, but I think this more over a term of the minority status or presence, I think this could be made more beneficial for future analysis and studies. What is quite obvious is that's quite different from the US case, where we find, which of course the community, the K-pop fan community is much bigger and much more, maybe more active and inclusive in terms of age groups as well, where we find a lot of older people who are engaged in political movements and also as engaged as fans. This is kind of strange to me to see that I haven't found any or only a few people with so-called Korean migrant background who identify themselves as K-pop fans. So if I found them, then they had this kind of cultural intermediary position. Then they were quite a bit older than the fan groups. They were organizing events. They were these cultural intermediaries. So they were bridging people. They were contacting the embassies and getting funds for the events and so on. So, so the second or third generation immigrant generation of Korean or even Turkish third or fourth generation. So the Turkish community might be stronger or more active than the Korean persons in the fandom in Germany. So this is quite different from the US case from my perspective. And your first remark on the hybrid character of K-pop, of course it's hybrid in terms of the textual, as a textual compound. So textual means not visually, not necessarily the lyrics, but also the visual textuality and sound, how the sounds are composed. This is very hybrid, but to be honest, any cultural expression is hybrid. So there's no autochthonous or autonomous cultural expression. So we always find a certain degree of cultural hybridity. So I think this concept of hybridity is not very strong to explain what we experience, or helpful in explaining what we experience with K-pop fandom. So that we always discuss about whether K-pop is mainstream or K-pop is a subculture. So because these are seem to be clear concepts, but I think that they don't explain either the specificities and the uniqueness of the phenomenon. So what I found useful was the Torino's concept of the cultural cohort, which is quite vague, but which gives which accepts the idea of K-pop as a fluid, as a very of the fluid identities attached to the K-pop phenomenon. Yeah, so that we find people who have for a certain period of time, so maybe for 5 or 6 years, they are very active, and then they drop out of the fan circle because they start studying or start a job. They don't have enough time anymore to keep track with their peers and so on, keep up with the very trendy and real-time K-pop idol news. Yeah, so it needs a lot of engagement and time. It's very costs a lot of time and energy to really keep track with what's going on in the scene in K-pop industry. And then they have to translate it into their own context. And I think at a certain period of time, it's not anymore feasible for them. So they drop out, and then they turn into Korean study students probably, and engaged into more serious academic endeavors and so on. So yeah, but I think we have to look for social or sociological or anthropological models, which also include the forms of digitality, because this is a kind of new form that is digitally dispersed and it's very centered on digital technologies. So I think we haven't yet the right models to really explain it in full in depth.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you for the questions and also these answers. And I see there is one further hand here. Meet Kwak Young-ah. You can go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I consider this online event is one of little benefit we have in this world of pandemic time. I'm actually connected from Italy. I'm a lecturer at the Luis University. It was quite interesting to see this presentation. Thank you very much for Dr. Fuhr, because I'm also looking into this K-pop industry and then also K-pop in Italy. So it was quite good to see that in your volume of your data, what kind of information I found it. I have very small questions. One of your slides when you talked about K-pop industry, about the conflict, you mentioned about the behavior code as a filial piety. Of course, we all know what you mean by filial piety. So I try to see that whether you determine the relationship between the singers and, for example, these entertainment owners as the singers or parents, or so it was sort of not clear whether you're talking about the senior junior relationship among the singers or entertainment industry. So I hope that you can provide some more information about what you mean by filial piety in the behavior code in the K-pop industry. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for these questions. Yes, of course, I have to apologize. This was quite quick and rough to show that there's that there's a certain conflict when it comes to these globalization strategies that many of the entertainment companies pursue. And with the filial piety, this is what I observed in my earlier studies of the immigrant pop idols who entered the K-pop industry, and companies who really had a hard time to pursue their career because they have realized or experienced these kind of cultural gap, what they termed cultural gap between, for example, the US industry and also the educational system in the West and the Korean way of communication, especially in the workplace. And with filial piety, of course, this is the seniority principle, which was mentioned several times, which was quite difficult for them to get along with. Yeah, because that's not the competency and skills are ruling the discourse, but the age grade is kind of important and defines the hierarchy within these groups and the relationships between the idol aspirants, but also the already idols who have debuted, but also then the trainers and the managers and the producers. So the whole different people involved in the entertainment companies and this is similar to the business culture that we find in Korean companies. And this is, I think, quite different, or is felt and observed as a very as a boundary or as an obstacle to really enter this industry. And then, of course, people who really entered the Idol Academy, so that the system, they told me about these Insong Kyoyuk, so that they are really trained in certain codes of behavior, how they have to perform. So especially female young idol aspirants have to perform in front of male business people who gather around in certain settings and so on. So this is part of the training system. And this is also part of the bigger culture, which is kind of observed as part of this culture, right? And this is a big conflict when it comes to recruiting underage youngsters from overseas. And I met some German fangirls who really had the dream to become a K-pop star, and they had auditioned with a big entertainment company castings in Seoul, and then they so during the years, so over the years, they found it really hard that they wouldn't get an entry into this business because they were underage, and they told me that their parents wouldn't allow them to get rid of all their freedom, the private freedom, and disconnect with their private and personal relationships to the family. Also, all the things which are part of the contracts that they would have to sign. Yeah? And so this is really kind of internalized conflict that the K-pop industry has to negotiate somehow. And maybe also boundary in terms of expanding the markets. And maybe it's easier in other regions where there are similar cultural experiences or educational systems where it's not received as kind of alienating.
Thank you very much. I think now we are approaching to the time limit, but if there is no other questions, Dr. Fuhr, you mentioned before that there might be your former these interviewees or colleagues who might be present here. So
yeah. I'm not quite sure. Her name is Lisa, so I see two Lisas. It's one maybe without the surname. I'm not quite sure, Lisa, if you are the one. But if you want to add something or comment, you're, I think, welcome to do if you have a microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so this is Gwendolyn Dumling. I'm actually going to join a panel at the last day of this conference series. And I was also, I still listen and I still like K-pop. And yeah, so I find it very funny because when I listened to your presentation, I saw a lot of aspects that coincided with my own stories, especially the dance part. It was almost a bit scary, you could say, that so many people share apparently passion for dance and then somehow turn into an honest interest. This turns into an honest interest in different cultures. And yes, so I generally just really liked your presentation, and I'm not going to spoil myself because on Friday I will actually just present a personal account on exactly the things and the phenomena you identified in your study. So thank you for your presentation.
Yes, thank you for your comments. So I'm also looking forward to your Friday's presentation, and maybe a comment on the fan studies. I think it's also for me it's necessary to look into fandom from an academic perspective, because still there is the fandom is still seen as not as a really an academic subject. So there's still people like Adorno and the Frankfurt School, so skepticism around in musicology, which portrays the fan as a passive consumer, and that's of course not the case, and hasn't been the case, has never been the case. And I think it's necessary to look into the dynamics, into the social dynamics of fandom, and to look what we can learn more from the academia, but also from the wider society, what we can learn from these vibrant fandom, especially when it comes from non-Anglophone popular cultural production. I think this is quite new. We know this from Japanese pop in Germany. And even there's really scarce academic encounter with this popular music. And even if we look into popular music studies, which reaches back 20 years from now, which took popular music as a serious subject of study, we don't find only a small number of encounters with popular music outside of the US or British and German sphere of popular music production and consumption. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn, and lots to do still because it's a vibrant cultural phenomenon in this society, in our societies, and I think there's something really serious. There's a serious core to it.
Yeah, great. I think we again had a quite excellent, conversations. And first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Fuhr, for your very interesting talk today, and all participants for their joining the discussions and also raising questions. We will definitely continue to discuss these things which were raised today. And tomorrow, we will have our fourth session on fan entrepreneurship, fandom agency, and marketing of Hallyu in Israel. So, I mean, Dr. Fuhr just mentioned that fans are not always, these passive participants, but they can be active generators and creators. In this sense, I think that tomorrow's presentation would have connected relevance there. And the presenter will be Dr. Irina Lian from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So, all right, I think we are all set for today. And all have a nice evening, and see you tomorrow.